A millionaire hires a nanny for his sick son, installs cameras, and discovers something shocking. The Cortez mansion stood imposingly against the Boston sky, its mirrored windows reflecting the setting October sun. William Cortez watched the city from his office on the top floor, a glass of whiskey untouched on the mahogany table. His dark brown eyes were fixed on a distant point, while his mind wandered through the empty corridors of his own life. The soft sound of the door opening brought him back to reality. Abigail, his assistant for over a decade, entered with a black folder in her hands. "Mr. Cortez?" "The CVs of the candidate she requested," she said, her voice professional, though William detected a note of concern. She knew the situation too well to maintain total neutrality. "How many this time?" he asked, turning his chair to face her. 15, all with excellent references and experience with children who need special care. William picked up the folder, quickly flipping through the documents. Each candidate looked perfect on paper, but he knew better than anyone how appearances could be deceiving. "Schedule interviews with the top 3 for tomorrow," he said. Abigail hesitated. "Dr. Matthews called. He insists that Oscar needs stability. Changing babysitters every 2 months isn't—" "I pay Dr. Matthews to look after my son's health, not to give me advice on how to run my household," William cut in, his voice as icy as the wind outside. Abigail nodded, recognizing the cue to leave. Before she left, however, she stopped at the door. "Oscar asked if you'd have dinner with him tonight." A muscle tensed in William's jaw. "I have a video conference with investors in Tokyo. Tell him that." He paused, remembering the disappointed expression his son always had when he received his apology. "Cancel the conference. I'll be there at 7, alone again." William opened the top drawer of his desk and took out a photograph. Catherine was smiling in the picture, her green eyes shining with the same intensity that Oscar had inherited. 5 years had passed since the accident, but the pain remained as vivid as on the first day. Downstairs, he heard Oscar's characteristic cough, followed by the gentle voice of Mrs. Peterson, the temporary nanny. She was the 5th this year. William knew he needed to find someone permanent, but the idea of entrusting his son's care to a stranger terrified him. Walking down the marble stairs, he found Oscar in the living room, wrapped in his favorite blanket, watching a documentary about the oceans. When Oscar saw him, the boy smiled, and William felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Oscar was a living image of Catherine, from his golden curls to the freckles that dotted his nose. "Dad, are you having dinner with me tonight?" "Yes, champ. How about we order that pizza you liked?" Oscar's eyes lit up, but then a cough shook him. Mrs. Peterson approached with the inhaler, and William watched helplessly as his son struggled to breathe. Moments like this reminded him of how much was at stake, how much he needed to protect the only person who still mattered in his life. Later, after putting Oscar to bed, William sat in his private office, turning on the monitors that showed every room in the house. It was his nightly ritual to check that everything was in order and that his son was safe. Tomorrow, he would interview the candidates, and one of them would be chosen to be part of this hermetically controlled world he had built. Among the CVs, one name caught his eye: Aurora Martinez. Her references were impeccable, her experience with sick children extensive, but it was something about her photo that stopped him, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, unlike the rehearsed expressions of the other candidates. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his lawyer, Richard. "William, I received the documents for the new nanny. Do you want me to include the same confidentiality clauses?" "All of them, and add one about the security cameras. You know that can scare off good candidates, don't you?" William looked at Catherine's photo again. "Anyone who has nothing to hide won't have a problem with surveillance." Hanging up the phone, he turned his attention to Aurora's CV for tomorrow. He would meet her in person, and something told him that this interview would be different from the others. Whether it was her exceptional qualifications or the sincere look in her photograph, there was something about her that piqued his curiosity, and William Cortez wasn't used to being curious about anyone. The Cortez Enterprises meeting room was silent when Aurora Martinez entered. The natural light coming in through the large windows contrasted with the austere atmosphere of the room. Dressed in a discreet navy blue ensemble, she maintained a serene posture, though her heart was beating fast. William Cortez watched her from the other side of the glass table, analyzing every detail. His eyes, trained in assessing people, noticed her delicate but firm hands, the way she maintained eye contact without showing intimidation, and above all, the calm that emanated from her presence. "Ms. Martinez," he began, his voice controlled, "your resume is impressive. 6 years caring for children with special needs, specialization in pediatric nursing, exemplary letters of recommendation, almost too perfect." Aurora smiled slightly. "Mr. Cortez, I learned early on that perfection is an illusion. What I offer is not perfection, but absolute dedication and honesty." The answer took him by surprise. Normally, candidates would burst into assurances of competence. "Tell me about your last experience," he asked, leaning back in his chair. "I looked after little William for 3 years. He had cystic fibrosis. They were challenging but rewarding years." "Unfortunately," she paused, and William noticed a glint of emotion in her eyes. "William passed away 6 months ago. That's when I decided I needed some time to process the loss." "And what makes you think you're ready to take on another complex case?" "Because grief taught me compassion, not fear. Your son deserves someone who understands that caring goes beyond administering medication and following protocols." William stood up and walked over to the window. "Mrs. Martinez, I need to be straightforward. This position requires more than professional competence. There are security cameras throughout the house. Your privacy will be limited. Many find it too invasive. I understand your need to protect your son, Mr. Cortez. If I were in your position, I would probably do the same," she said, pausing significantly. "But I hope that in time you'll realize that trust is built through actions, not surveillance." He turned, staring at her with intensity. "Are you questioning me, Ms. Martinez?" "No, sir. I'm being honest, as I promised at the beginning of this conversation." A dense silence filled the room. Abigail, who was watching the interaction from the doorway, held her breath. In 15 years, she had never seen someone so subtly challenge her boss. "Would you like to meet Oscar?" William's question surprised even him. On the 4th floor of the mansion, Oscar was finishing his physiotherapy session when they entered. His green eyes lit up at the sight of his father, but it was Aurora who captured his attention. "You must be Oscar," she said, approaching with a warm smile. "I hear you're a fan of documentaries about oceans." The boy's face lit up. "Do you like them too?" "I love them. Did you know that humpback whales sing different songs every year?" Oscar laughed, a sound that made William freeze. He hadn't heard that laugh in weeks. For the next hour, Aurora talked to Oscar about abyssal seas, coral reefs, and her experience as a volunteer at an aquarium. William watched, noticing how she naturally included breathing exercises in the conversation, without Oscar realizing he was being treated. "Dad!" Oscar called out when Aurora left to get some water. "She's different from the others." William nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, she is." Later, in his office, William was rereading the employment contract. Abigail came in with a cup of coffee. "The other candidates are still waiting, sir." "Cancel the interviews," he replied without taking his eyes off the document. "Miss Martinez starts tomorrow. Are you sure?" She was quite frank during the interview. William looked up. Precisely why. "Oscar needs someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth, even if it means confronting me occasionally." That evening, while checking the cameras one last time, William stopped at the recording of the conversation between Aurora and Oscar. There was something about the way she interacted with his son, a mixture of professionalism and genuine affection that he couldn't ignore. His phone vibrated with a message from Richard. "Contract sent to Ms. Martinez. She has already signed and returned it. Start tomorrow at 7 a.m. William looked at the photo of Catherine on his desk. "What would you think of her, my love?" he whispered into the silence. The answer came in the form of a memory. Catherine always said that eyes don't lie. and Aurora Martinez's eyes conveyed a truth he couldn't deny. Closing the monitors, William allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had found someone who could bring light not only into Oscar's life, but into the whole house that had lived in shadows for so long. The dawn brought with it a soft mist that covered the gardens of the Cortez mansion. Aurora arrived punctually at 7, carrying a modest bag and a small package wrapped in colored paper. Abigail greeted her in the entrance hall, her heels echoing on the marble floor. Mr. Cortez is video conferencing, but he left detailed instructions about Oscar's routine, Abigail explained, guiding her up the stairs. The list of medications, schedules, and emergency contacts is in his room. In the hallway on the second floor, they stopped in front of a door decorated with phosphorescent stars. Abigail hesitated before opening it. "Ms. Martinez, Oscar had a difficult night. The change in temperature always affects his breathing." Aurora nodded in understanding. "Can I see the night's records? It would help to understand his breathing pattern." Inside the room, Oscar slept restlessly, the heart monitor next to the bed emitting a soft, steady beep. Aurora approached silently, watching the vital signs with experienced eyes. "Good morning, little navigator," she whispered as Oscar began to wake up. The boy opened his eyes slowly, a faint smile appearing on his pale face. "You really came." "Of course I came, and I brought something special for you." She handed him the colorful package. Oscar carefully unwrapped it, revealing a miniature constellation projector. "Wow. It's like having the universe in my bedroom. I thought we could create our own starry ocean here. But first, how about a nutritious breakfast to regain your energy?" On the other side of the mansion, William watched the interaction through the cameras. Something about the naturalness with which Aurora moved around the room, the way she managed to entertain Oscar while discreetly checking his vital signs, intrigued him. Throughout the morning, Aurora established a gentle routine. She turned the breathing exercises into fun games, told stories during the nebulizer sessions, and managed to get Oscar to take all his medication without protest. During lunch, William decided to make a surprise appearance. He found Oscar sitting at the kitchen table, eating a colorful soup that wasn't part of his usual menu. "What kind of soup is that?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. "It's my special recipe," replied Aurora, undeterred. "It's rich in nutrients and low in sodium according to medical restrictions. The secret is in the fresh herbs." Oscar raised his spoon excitedly. "Dad, try it. It's like magic. It doesn't taste like medicine." William hesitated for a moment before accepting the spoonful his son offered. The taste surprised him. It really was delicious. "Ms. Martinez, can we talk in private?" In his office, William closed the door. "I appreciate your initiative, but any changes to Oscar's diet need to be approved first. With all due respect, Mr. Cortez, the soup follows all dietary restrictions. I have the complete composition here." She handed over a detailed sheet. "Besides, I've noticed that Oscar is resistant to eating. Turning the meal into something pleasurable could help his recovery." William studied the document, looking for flaws. He found none. "There's something else I need to discuss," she continued. Oscar mentioned that he'd like to see the garden. With the weather improving, a few minutes of morning sun would be beneficial for him. "Absolutely not. The outside air can strengthen his immune system under controlled conditions," Aurora interrupted. "Isolating him completely from the world won't protect him forever." The silence that followed was tense. William struggled internally between his need for control and the logic of her words. "1 week," he finally said. "Give me positive results in a week, and I'll consider your suggestions about outside activities." In the evening, after Oscar had fallen asleep, Aurora was organizing her notes when she came across a drawing he had made. 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one medium-sized, all smiling under a starry sky. William, who had spent the day alternating between meetings and monitoring the cameras, found the drawing on his desk the next morning with a note attached. "Mr. Cortez, Oscar has a heart bigger than his room and dreams bigger than his limitations. He drew this today, talking about how nice it would be to watch the stars for real one day." Sometimes the greatest acts of protection involve allowing small, calculated risks respectfully. Aurora Martinez. Sitting back in his chair, William looked longingly at the drawing. Catherine's words echoed in his mind. Love without freedom is a gilded cage, my love. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if his protective methods weren't actually stifling Oscar's chances of living fully. On the monitor, he watched Aurora adjusting the star projector, creating a private universe on the ceiling of Oscar's room. Oscar laughed, pointing at the constellations, his eyes shining with a joy William hadn't seen in a long time. Perhaps, William thought, it was time he learned to let go of the reins a little. Aurora's first month at the Cortez mansion passed quickly, bringing subtle but significant changes. The most noticeable was Oscar's frequent smile, which now echoed through the previously silent corridors. William watched through the cameras, noticing how his son seemed stronger, more lively, despite the limitations of his condition. One particularly clear morning, William canceled an important meeting when he saw on the monitor that Oscar was having a respiratory crisis. He rushed to his son's room, only to find Aurora already controlling the situation with a confidence that left him speechless. "Breathe with me, Captain," she said softly, sitting behind Oscar on the bed and guiding his breathing. "Remember our story about the diver. Let him go up to the surface very slowly." Oscar, leaning against her, followed her breathing rhythm, his small hands squeezing her arms. William stood in the doorway, invisible to both of them, observing the intimacy of that moment. "All right," Aurora continued. "Now tell me 3 things you can see." "The star projector." Oscar breathed calmer. "My ocean book and Mom's picture." William felt his heart squeeze. Catherine's picture was on the bedside table, smiling eternally at the son who looked so much like her. "Great. 2 things you can touch. My blanket and your necklace." Aurora smiled, letting Oscar play with the little anchor-shaped pendant she always wore. "Perfect. Something you can smell. The chamomile tea you make." The crisis passed gradually, leaving Oscar exhausted but stable. When he finally fell asleep, Aurora tucked him into bed with motherly care. When she turned around, she was startled to see William. "Mr. Cortez, I'm sorry. I didn't see you. How long have you been using this technique with him?" "The anchoring technique?" "Since the 2nd week. It helps prevent panic. During crises, by focusing on the senses." William ran his hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "Why wasn't I informed?" "It's in the daily report I send you," she replied softly. "Page 3, paragraph 2 of last week's report." He remembered the document he had barely skimmed, too busy with mergers and acquisitions. Guilt hit him like a punch. "Mr. Cortez," Aurora hesitated before continuing, "can I make a suggestion?" He nodded, still watching his sleeping son. "Oscar needs his father as much as he needs his medication. Your presence has a therapeutic effect that no treatment can replace." "I have a company to run," he defended himself, but his voice lacked conviction. "And you have a son to love," she replied firmly. "Allow me to show you something." Aurora opened a folder she kept organized in the bedroom. "These are the records of Oscar's vital signs. Notice how the numbers improve significantly when you're present. Yesterday, during the dinner you shared, his saturation remained stable for hours." William examined the graph, his analytical gaze recognizing the pattern she was pointing out. "Why do you keep such detailed records?" "Because care isn't just about administering medication, Mr. Cortez. It's about understanding every aspect that affects his well-being." That afternoon, William canceled all his meetings. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to spend hours with Oscar, listening to him talk about his maritime discoveries, the stories Aurora told, and his dreams of one day seeing the ocean for real. Aurora discreetly watched the interaction between father and son, a soft smile on her lips. Abigail approached her in the monitor room. "First time I've seen him like this since Catherine left," the assistant commented. "He's so afraid of losing Oscar that sometimes he forgets to live," Aurora replied. "How did you manage to convince him?" "I didn't. I just showed him that love and protection don't have to be mutually exclusive. In the evening, after Oscar had fallen asleep, William found Aurora in the kitchen preparing the chamomile tea Tia's son loved so much. "Miss Martinez." "Aurora, please," she corrected. "Aurora," he said, smiling. "Thank you for today, for everything." She returned the smile, that genuine smile that had intrigued him since the first interview. "Oscar is an extraordinary boy, Mr. Cortez. He doesn't just need to survive. He deserves to flourish." William picked up a cup of tea, inhaling its soft aroma. Catherine used to say something like that. It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife voluntarily to anyone in years. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable but full of mutual understanding. That night, before going to sleep, William turned off the cameras in Oscar's room for the first time. Some things, he realized, needed to be felt with the heart, not monitored by screens. Autumn painted the mansion's gardens in golden hues as Aurora completed 2 months of work. The routine had settled comfortably, and even William was beginning to relax his strict security protocols. However, an accidental discovery was about to shake up the harmony that had been achieved. During a particularly hectic afternoon, while organizing some documents in William's office at his request, Aurora accidentally knocked over an old folder. As she picked up the scattered papers, her eyes caught something that made her freeze. A police report about the accident that had killed Catherine Cortez. Normally she would have put it away immediately, respecting her employer's privacy, but one sentence jumped out at her. Suspicious circumstances regarding brake system failure. "What are you doing?" William's voice startled her. He was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of restrained fury. "Mr. Cortez, I'm sorry. The briefcase fell, and I—" "Get out!" His voice was pure ice. "Please, let me explain." "Get out!" The scream reverberated through the walls, making Aurora back away. In the hallway, she found Oscar, startled by the noise. "What happened to Dad?" "Nothing, darling. Sometimes adults need a moment alone." She led him to his room, trying to remain outwardly calm while her heart was pounding. Hours later, when Oscar finally fell asleep, Aurora found an envelope in her bag. Inside was a large check and a note. "Your services are no longer required." Instead of collecting her things and leaving, she did something unexpected. She went to William's office and found him sitting in the dark, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. "You can't fire me." William looked up in disbelief. "Excuse me. Oscar has an important appointment tomorrow. Next week we start aquatic physiotherapy, and in 3 days, he has a presentation on the whale project. I'm not going to abandon him in the middle of all this. You've crossed every line." "No, Mr. Cortez. You've built so many walls that you've forgotten there are people on the other side." She took a deep breath. "Including your son. Don't you dare mention it. Oscar asks about his mother every day. And do you know what he wants to know most? If she loved him. Because his father never talks about her. Never shares memories. Never enough." William stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass. "You don't know anything about loss." "I know more than you think," she replied softly. "William wasn't the first patient I lost, and each loss has taught me that silence doesn't protect. It suffocates." The silence that followed was deafening. William staggered to the window, his back stiff with tension. "It was my fault," he whispered at last. "Catherine wanted to go to Oscar's recital. I was busy with an important merger. I said I'd send the driver, but she insisted on going alone. If I'd gone, the accident wouldn't have happened. Or would I have lost them both?" added Aurora gently. William turned, his eyes shining with restrained tears. The report. There were suspicions of sabotage, a competitor out to get me. Catherine died because of me. She died because someone committed a terrible crime. "How can you be so sure it's not your fault?" Aurora asked gently. William, his face twisted with guilt, shook his head. "How can you be so sure?" Aurora met his gaze. "Because I see how you protect Oscar, how you would sacrifice everything for him, the man I—" She stopped abruptly, realizing she had said too much. William noticed. His eyes softened, meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Miss Martinez?" he began. "I'm sorry," she said, retreating toward the door, embarrassed. "That was inappropriate, Aurora," he called, using her first name for only the second time since she had started working there. "Please stay." She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him. "Oscar needs you," he continued quietly, his voice unsteady. "And maybe I do too." At that moment, a scream came from Oscar's room. They both ran, finding the boy sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face. "Mommy!" he cried. "I dreamt about Mommy." William hesitated, but then sat beside Oscar and pulled him into his arms. "Do you want me to tell you about the first time your mother took you to see the dolphins?" Oscar's eyes brightened with curiosity. This was the first time his father had willingly shared a memory of Catherine. Aurora quietly moved to leave, but William reached out, his hand gently holding her wrist. "Stay," he said softly. In the early hours of that morning, walls came down that had long stood between them. William spoke of Catherine, her laughter, her love of the sea, her passion for life. Oscar fell asleep with a smile, finally getting to know the mother he had lost so early. Aurora's unintentional confession had created a subtle tension in the Cortez mansion. In the days that followed, William alternated between moments of surprising closeness and exaggerated professionalism. Oscar, with his perceptiveness, began to notice the changing dynamic between his father and his caregiver. One particularly cold November morning, during a pool therapy session, Oscar decided to address it. "Aurora," he asked with a mischievous smile, "do you like my father?" The question took Aurora by surprise. She almost dropped the flotation device. "Of course I do, Oscar. Your father is a good man." "Not like that," Oscar insisted, eyes twinkling with mischief. "You like him like Mom liked him. I saw you looking at each other at dinner yesterday." Aurora felt her face warm. "Oscar, the relationship between your father and me is strictly professional, and he smiles differently when you're around, like he did with Mom in those old photos." Before she could respond, Abigail approached the pool's edge. "Miss Martinez, Mr. Cortez requests your presence in his office." On her way to the office, Aurora took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She found William by the window, his posture tense. "We need to set some boundaries," he said without turning. "Mr. Cortez," she started. "If this is about what happened the other night." "It's about everything," he interrupted, finally turning to face her. "About how Oscar is getting too attached. About how things are changing. Change isn't always bad. It is when it puts my son's well-being at risk." He ran a hand through his hair, his voice thick with anxiety. "Oscar has already lost his mother. I can't allow him to become attached to someone who could leave at any moment." "Like all the other nannies you've dismissed," she countered, her tone challenging. "Exactly. It was safer that way." "For whom, Mr. Cortez? For Oscar or for you?" The silence hung heavy between them. William walked to his desk and picked up an old photo. "Catherine and I met in college. She was everything I wasn't. Spontaneous, full of life. She told me I needed to learn to dance in the rain instead of always building shelters." Aurora took a step forward. She was right. "When I lost her," he continued, his voice faltering, "I promised I would never let anyone become that important again. I vowed to protect Oscar from similar pain." "And yet," Aurora replied gently, "you're failing miserably." William looked up, caught off guard. "Because love isn't something we can control," she continued softly. "Your son needs to learn to love, to trust, to connect with people, even if it means taking a risk." "Like you?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Like anyone he chooses to let into his heart." He closed the distance between them, his gaze unwavering. "And what about me, Miss Martinez? What choices do I have?" She felt her heart race. "The same as everyone else. You can hide behind walls. Or—" She didn't finish, because he had come even closer, his hand brushing lightly against her face. "Dad!" "Aurora!" Oscar's voice shattered the moment, as he ran into the office, dripping wet. Abigail hurried behind him with a towel. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cortez." He insisted on showing off his swimming. William looked from Oscar to Aurora, and then at the photo of Catherine on his desk. 3 worlds, each demanding a piece of his heart. "Oscar, you need to dry off and warm up," Aurora said, regaining her composure. "Come on, before you catch a cold." As she let Oscar out, William called after her. "Miss Martinez." She stopped but didn't turn. "Tomorrow night, after Oscar has gone to sleep, can we continue our conversation?" "I'm not sure we should, Mr. Cortez." "Please?" His vulnerability surprised her. "We need to sort this out. For Oscar." "For Oscar." She agreed quietly, knowing they were both lying. It wasn't just for Oscar, and that was exactly the problem. That night, William turned off the cameras in Oscar's room. Some things, he realized, needed to be felt with the heart, not observed through a screen. A storm hit Boston the next evening, bringing rain, strong winds, and a severe respiratory crisis for Oscar. William and Aurora spent the night in his room, each coping with fear in their own way. She stayed calm, administering medication and monitoring his vitals, while he paced, alternating between calls to doctors and barely contained panic. "His heart rate is too high," Aurora murmured, her eyes on the monitor. "We need to calm him down." "I've already called an ambulance," William replied, pale with worry. "No," Aurora said firmly. "Taking him to the hospital in this storm will only make things worse. Trust me." Their gazes met through the dim light of the star projector, Oscar's labored breaths filling the silence. "Mr. Cortez," she called softly, "I need you to sit here." "What?" "Please, sit on the bed and lean back against the pillows. Oscar will feel your breathing and follow." William obeyed reluctantly, allowing Aurora to position Oscar against his chest. Gradually, Oscar's breathing matched his father's rhythm, his small body relaxing. "Tell a story," Oscar whispered weakly. William froze. He wasn't used to telling stories. Catherine had always done that. Aurora reached out, placing a comforting hand on his. "It was a summer night." He began hesitantly. "When your mother and I met. She was dancing in the rain on campus, and I thought she was crazy." The memories started flowing, each one finding its voice. Oscar listened, fighting sleep, his eyes wide with fascination. "She said life was too short to wait for the sun," William continued, his voice thick with emotion, "and that sometimes you have to dance in the storm." A loud clap of thunder made Oscar cringe. Aurora quickly adjusted the star projector, casting a soft, ocean-like glow around the room. "Look, Captain," she whispered. "Even storms can be beautiful when seen from the right place." Oscar finally drifted into a peaceful sleep, his breathing steady. William, however, remained still, as if any movement might shatter the fragile peace they had achieved. "You should rest," he said softly to Aurora, who had stayed by Oscar's side through it all. "I'll stay with him." "I know you can stay with him," she replied, arranging the covers. "But you don't have to be alone." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of rain against the windows and Oscar's soft breathing. "Do you know what else Catherine told me that night?" murmured William after a long moment. "That some people are like lighthouses," he continued, his voice low. "They don't drive away the storm, but they help us navigate it." Aurora felt the weight of those words, understanding what he was really saying. "Mr. Cortez? William?" he corrected, his tone soft. "After tonight, I think we can dispense with the formalities." She nodded, a small smile on her lips. "William, sometimes lighthouses need guidance too. That's why they work in pairs," he replied, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart leap. The storm outside began to subside, but the one raging inside them was only beginning to gain strength. Oscar stirred in his sleep, muttering something about stars and oceans, unaware of the significant moment unfolding around him. Abigail found them like this the next morning, Oscar sleeping peacefully between them, William and Aurora sitting on opposite sides of the bed, united by their shared vigil, and something else neither of them was ready to name. "Coffee's ready," she announced softly, noticing the dark circles under their eyes. "And the medical reports you requested have arrived, Mr. Cortez." "Thank you, Abigail," he replied, still not taking his eyes off Aurora. "Please cancel my appointments for today. I'll stay at home." The assistant smiled discreetly as she left. Some storms, she thought, bring more than destruction. They bring renewal. The end of November brought with it not only the most intense cold, but also a noticeable change in the dynamics of the Cortez mansion. After the night of the storm, William started working more from home. His eyes often strayed from the financial reports to observe Oscar's therapy sessions or the moments of study with Aurora. One particularly cold afternoon, while Oscar was taking his post-lunch siesta, William found Aurora in the library, organizing materials for the boys' school project. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Aurora straightened up, sensing the seriousness in his voice. "About Oscar? About us?" The word hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. "Richard found out more information about Catherine's accident," he continued, moving closer to the window. "The sabotage? It wasn't a competitor." Aurora left the papers on the table, giving her full attention to William. "It was someone inside the company, someone I trusted." Her voice trembled slightly. "We found out yesterday. The former head of security, Maxwell Bennett, confessed everything to the police. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to understand why I built all these walls, why I installed so many cameras, why I'm so afraid of trusting." She added softly, "Yes." He moved closer, stopping a few steps away from her. "But you broke down every wall I built with your honesty, your dedication to Oscar, A coughing fit from Oscar, heard through the monitor, interrupted the moment. They both moved instinctively toward the door, but the sound soon ceased, indicating that the boy had gone back to sleep peacefully. "See?" Aurora said with a small smile. "Not all interruptions are emergencies." William nodded, swallowing dryly. "Catherine always said that true love isn't just about protecting, but about setting free. I didn't understand that until you came along." Aurora took a step back. "I'm your employee. I look after your son. We can't or won't." The question caught her off guard. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because I have my own walls," she finally admitted. "William wasn't just a patient I lost. He was my brother. For 3 years I cared for him, battling cystic fibrosis. I gave up everything, relationships, career, personal life. When he left, she took a deep breath. I promised myself that I would never again allow myself to love someone I could lose." William reduced the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "So, we're two cowards. Two wounded protectors," she corrected, not resisting the touch. "Oscar asked me something yesterday," he said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "He asked if it was wrong to be happy, even though he missed his mother." Aurora felt tears forming in her eyes. "And what did you say?" "I said that Catherine would be furious if we thought that honoring her memory meant living in sadness." At that moment, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made them separate quickly. Abigail entered, stopping abruptly as she sensed the charged atmosphere. "Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Cortez. The counsel is waiting on the line." William nodded, reluctant to break the moment. "I'll be there in a minute." When Abigail left, he turned to Aurora one last time. "Have dinner with me tonight after Oscar goes to sleep? I don't think it's appropriate." "Not as boss and employee," he said, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "As William and Aurora." She hesitated, years of self-preservation fighting the urge to say yes. "And Oscar?" "Oscar already knows. In fact, he was the one who suggested that I stop being silly and ask you to dinner." An involuntary smile appeared on her lips. "He said that in those exact words. So what do you say?" Before she could answer, Oscar's sleepy voice sounded through the monitor. "Dad." Aurora, saved by the gong, muttered as she moved toward the door. "That's not a no," observed William. "It's not a yes either," she replied, but a smile followed her up the stairs, making her heart dance in a way it hadn't felt for years. In Oscar's room, she found the boy sitting on the bed, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "I dreamt about Mommy," he said. When she sat down next to me, she was smiling and said she was happy. Aurora felt her heart squeeze. "Is that so?" "Yes," and she said that sometimes you have to be brave to be happy. She looked at the door where William was now standing, watching the scene with soft eyes. "You know something, Oscar? I think your mother was very wise. So, you're having dinner with Dad?" Aurora laughed, surprised by the boy's insight. "We'll see. Now, how about we finish that project on whales?" The dinner took place not that night, but a week later, when the first snow of winter began to fall on Boston. William had prepared everything with meticulous care. The table on the enclosed, heated veranda decorated with soft lights, the specially chosen menu, even a small jazz ensemble playing in the background. Aurora arrived punctually at 8 o'clock after putting Oscar to bed. She wore a simple navy blue dress that made her eyes sparkle like sapphires. "I thought you said no," teased William, pulling out the chair for her. "Technically, I never said no," she replied, smiling. "I just put it off until I was sure." "Sure of what?" "That it wouldn't harm Oscar." William poured wine for them both, his movements deliberately slow. "And you came to a conclusion?" "Actually, it was Oscar who helped me decide." She took a small sip of wine and reached into her pocket. She handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, 3 figures holding hands under a starry sky. In the top corner, a 4th figure surrounded by a golden glow was smiling at the group. "He said you're our family," she explained softly. "You, him, and me. Down here in Catherine," her voice faltered a little, "blessing us from above." William stared at the drawing for a long moment, his eyes welling up. He has the same gift as his mother for seeing beyond appearances. Dinner passed easily, with conversation flowing naturally between light and deep topics. They shared stories about their lives before they met, about William, about Catherine, and the fears they still carried, but also the hopes they were beginning to nurture. "You know what I miss most about Catherine," William said as they shared dessert. "Her ability to see beauty in everything, even in storms. Like Oscar observed, like you too," Aurora added, her voice soft. He reached for her hand across the table. "You brought color back into our lives." Before she could respond, a familiar sound came from Oscar's monitor, coughing, followed by crying. "I'm going to check on him," Aurora said, getting up to leave. "No," William stopped her, holding her hand. "Let me go. Stay and enjoy the wine, in Oscar's room." William found his son sitting on the bed, silent tears streaming down his face. "Hey, champ." "Nightmare?" William asked gently. Oscar shook his head. "Fear of what?" "Of Aurora leaving, like Mom." William sat on the bed, pulling his son close. "Oscar, look at me. Your mother never wanted to leave us and Aurora. She's not going anywhere. I can't promise what the future holds, son, but I can promise that I'll do everything I can to keep her in our lives." "Will that do?" Oscar nodded, snuggling into his father's arms. "Dad." "Do you still love Mom?" William kissed the top of his son's head. "I'll always love your mother. She gave me you, the greatest gift of my life." He smiled down at his son. "So, it's okay to love Aurora too?" "Yes, son. The heart has infinite room for love." When William returned to the balcony, he found Aurora gazing at the falling snow. She was holding his coat, which he had forgotten on the chair. "Is Oscar all right?" she asked as he approached. "Yes. I just needed some answers." "And did you get them?" she asked, turning to face him. "I think we all did today." He took the jacket from her hands and placed it on his shoulders. "Actually," he continued, "I think we all got some answers." Aurora smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "Don't say anything yet," he asked. "Just dance with me." Soft music filled the room as they moved slowly, the snow falling outside, creating an almost magical atmosphere. "Catherine would be proud," Aurora whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "Of what?" William asked, his voice low. "Of seeing you and Oscar living, not just surviving. William gently pushed her away so that he could look into her eyes. "That's thanks to you." "No," she replied, her voice soft. "It's thanks to the three of us, and to her." She looked at the drawing of Oscar on the table. Thanks to her, too. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, on the heated balcony, something new was blossoming. Not just love, but a deep understanding that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as challenges. That hearts, even bruised ones, have an infinite capacity for healing and renewal. ___